Now we have a final test that we're going to talk about today about comparing two populations. So in the previous examples, we were interested in population averages. Sometimes, however, we're interested in population proportions. So in the fear of crime survey, you might be interested in experiences with victimization. And you might argue that maybe freshmen have a higher level of victimization than non-freshmen. That they are more likely to experience victimization than sophomores, juniors, or seniors. If you're in this situation, then you'll want to conduct this kind of test of hypotheses. So a hypothesis test about the difference between two population proportions, assuming independent samples. Now, all of these steps are the same steps that we've already talked about. We can think about this test of hypotheses, again, within the context of the prison climate survey. So we might go out and take a random sample of, say, staff, and maybe a random sample of inmates, and we might ask these two different populations this dichotomous question. Really threatening situations can occur here. So if somebody puts a 1, that means they agree. If they respond with a 0, then they disagree. We can then calculate sample proportions for those samples. So here we might see that the sample proportion among staff was at about 70% of them agreed that really threatening situations can occur here. We can also see that the proportion of inmates equaled 0.5, so about 50% of the inmates also agreed that threatening situations occurred at these facilities. We can look at these sample statistics and we get the sense that the staff feel like the facilities are more threatening than the inmates. To rigorously test this claim, or to assess this pattern, we then conduct a test of hypotheses. This leads me to my first step, where I state my null and my alternative hypotheses. So the null hypothesis is that there's no difference between these two populations, that they are both under the impression, and that they are both equally likely to think that their facilities are threatening. The alternative hypothesis might be that staff are more likely than inmates to think really threatening situations can occur. Again, I have 3 alternative hypotheses to choose from. So my choice, again, is based off of my understanding of inmates and staff and how they view their facilities and how threatening they think their facilities are. With step 2, we state the significance level. So again, I set it to alpha equal to 0.05. Step 3, we determine the appropriate statistical test. So here we're conducting a differences between two population proportions test, assuming independent samples. So we know this because 1, we're talking about population proportions, and 2, we know this because the individuals in the inmate sample, their responses do not affect the responses that are made by the staff. Now there's one more criteria we need to satisfy when we're comparing the two population proportions. So we need to make sure that our sample sizes are large enough. So in order to check this, what we have to do is multiply the sample size from the first sample and multiply it by its sample proportion. If this is greater than or equal to 5, then half of that criteria is satisfied. Next, we take the sample size from that first sample and multiply it by 1 minus the sample proportion. If this value is greater than or equal to 5, then we've satisfied this proportion of the criteria. We then do the same thing for the second sample So we take the second sample size and multiply it by the second sample proportion. It's greater than or equal to 5, then we're good. We then take the second sample size and multiply it by 1 minus the second sample proportion. And if this is greater than or equal to 5, then again, we're good. So we can check the prison climate survey, and we see that in all 4 of these instances, this criteria has been satisfied. We then go on to step 4, where we determine the p-value and compare it to the significance level. So we go to SPSS and we calculate our p-value, which in this case equaled 0.000. So it was so small that SPSS just reported 3 zeros. We then compare it to our significance level. So since the p-value, which is approximately equal to 0.000, is less than 0.05, we know that what we've observed in real life is actually a rare event under the null hypothesis. So we have this doubting scientist who comes and says, these 2 groups are the same. Well, given the data that we saw, summarized by this p-value, we saw something that was very different from that claim. We saw a lot of evidence suggesting that these 2 groups are different. Step 5, we then reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis and interpret our results. So since the p-value is less than the significance level, we reject the null hypothesis and accept the alternative. So at the alpha equals the 0.05 level, we have sufficient evidence to conclude that staff are more likely than inmates to think really threatening situations occur at their facility.